Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from ChristaQuilts, back with another fun quilt for you to make. This is part of my do-it-yourself quilting series where I show you how to make a quilt from start to finish. I'm so excited to show you how to make my puzzle box quilt seen behind me. It's one of my free patterns that I offer over on my site at ChristaQuilts.com/free pattern. Now you can certainly pick and choose which parts of the quilting process you like to do best. Maybe you just like picking the fabrics. Maybe you love making the top. Or like me, maybe the machine quilting is your jam. Well, whichever ones you like, you can watch, fast forward, stop, and watch this over and over again until you're comfortable with your skills. Well, you know what? No matter which parts of the quilt you like, I'm here for all of it and I'm here to cheer you on. So let's dive in and get started. To make this quilt, you'll need a total of 80 pre-cut strips that measure 2.5 inches wide by 40 inches long. That's the equivalent of 2 strip rolls divided into lights and darks. I'm using fabrics from my Good Vibes fabric line for Benartex, and I specifically designed this fabric collection so that it would include half lights and half darks. Following the puzzle box pattern instructions on page 2, cut your strips into 320 light rectangles and 320 dark rectangles. I'm actually using the back side of my light fabrics so that they have more contrast with the darks. Every fabric has 2 sides, so you might as well use them, right? Following the free pattern on page 4, arrange your rectangles to create C-shaped units and backwards C-shaped units. Then join 2 units of the same fabrics to create 1 puzzle box block. Keep making more blocks until your quilt is as big as you want it to be. I like to chain piece or assembly line sew all of the blocks at once to speed things up. I'm sewing with a smaller stitch length, and I'll press my seams open so that they will lie nice and flat. Remember, you can use both sides of your lights for even more variety. Here I've flipped one of my sewn blocks over so that you can see how much lighter the same low volume fabric looks when using the back side instead of the front. To speed things up, sew blocks into sets of 4 going in opposite directions. Then lay the larger blocks out on a design wall or other large surface in a pleasing color arrangement, and then begin sewing them together. Join the rows to complete the quilt top. It's really important to press each and every seam as you go so the quilt top stays nice and flat for basting and quilting. So I didn't take any video or pictures when I basted my quilt. However, the process that I use is called spray basting, where I basically take the top and the backing outside, spray the wrong side, then assemble the layers inside on my design wall. I actually have several tutorials showing how to do this, so be sure to check out my other videos. In fact, you can try different methods for basting your quilt. You can try safety pin basting, you can hand baste it, or you can even get a long armor to quilt long stitches that temporarily hold your quilt while you machine quilt it. Whichever way you like to baste, it's totally fine as long as your quilt is nice and flat and will fit easily under your machine. So be sure to check out the description box for the links to the methods that I prefer to do when I'm basting my quilt. So I want to quilt wavy lines across my quilt because that's literally the easiest and fastest design that I know. So the first thing I need to do is make a quilting plan and then audition my thread choices. I'm going to set up my sewing machine for walking foot or dual feed quilting. This is the perfect choice when I want to quilt straight lines or some gentle curves. You can learn more about how to quilt this simple motif in my book 99 Machine Quilting Designs. My quilting plan consists of gentle wavy lines quilted from top to bottom across the quilt. I'll break that down by quilting a few anchor lines across the quilt to secure it first. I'll start on the right-hand side and quilt 1 pass of wavy lines about 4 inches apart, since that's half of the finished block size. Once I reach the center, I'll rotate the quilt so that the lines I just quilted are now to my left. Then continue with more anchor lines from the center back to the right again. I'll continue with several more passes across the quilt until I'm pleased with the density of the line spacing. I'm using one spool of Aurifil 100% cotton yellow thread for my Piece and Quilt Colors collection to quilt my puzzle box quilt. I'm using my Bernina dual feed along with the 20D foot to quilt it. The open toe will allow me to see what I'm doing. I'll increase my stitch length to 2.95, just under 3.0, and my presser foot pressure is set to 0. I've also lowered my top tension to 3.0. Your settings may vary depending on your machine. So here's what it looks like as I begin. I'm starting on the right-hand side of the quilt, just like I specified in my quilting plan. I'll start stitching at the top of the quilt in the batting to catch my threads. That will all get trimmed away later, so I don't have to worry about burying my thread tails. To form the wavy lines, I'll gently move the quilt back and forth or side to side. The more movement I do, the bigger my waves will be. I'll let them be totally random and just enjoy the process. My feed dogs are engaged just like regular sewing, so the machine is helping me pull the quilt through. I'm guiding it more than pushing it, and this is a very fun and easy design to do. My first pass of anchor lines across the quilt will be in between each vertical row of the blocks, so the lines will be about 8 inches apart. Notice how much room I have under the arm of my machine. My Bernina 770 QE has about 10 inches of throat space compared to a standard sewing machine that only has about 6 inches. This is the #1 reason I love this machine. But don't worry, even if you have a smaller machine, it's still the same process, it's just a lot more scrunching and smushing. Now I'm not rolling the quilt or using any specialty tools, just my hands. Here's a close-up of what that looks like. The quilting gloves help me grip the quilt, so it's easier to push under the machine. The Bernina dual feed is similar to walking foot quilting, and that it will feed the layers of the quilt evenly through the machine. And you can use either technique to get great results. This is just my personal preference. Notice how I'm only quilting the area between my hands or kind of near my hands. I will stop and adjust my hand position quite a lot so that I'm in a comfortable position the entire time I'm quilting. You can also see a close-up of those super light, low volume fabrics I've used since I'm using the back side of them. I really like the high contrast that it gives the quilt. Here I've sped things up a little so I can show you how I rotate the quilt once I reach the center. I'll stitch off the end of the quilt, then rotate, scrunch, and smush it under the machine as I go. So here's what it looks like after I've quilted about 2 passes across the quilt. The first pass, my lines were 8 inches apart, and then I quilted them again so that they were 4 inches apart. Watch how I smooth out the area in between my hands. I call this quilting in the valley. You want to keep the area you are quilting flat and smooth at all times to avoid puckers. Be sure your needle stops in the down position so that when you stop to adjust your hands, the quilt isn't going anywhere. I'm following the seam lines of the pieced rectangles as I stitch. Because the wavy lines are random, I can eyeball it when I don't have a seam line to follow. So let's watch a little bit more. I really find machine quilting to be quite relaxing. Now here's what it looks like after another pass across the quilt. The lines are now spaced 2 inches apart. At this point, you can decide how close or how far apart you want your line spacing to be. I'm doing another pass across the quilt so that my lines are now 1 inch apart. I'm really liking the texture it's starting to achieve. And the nice thing about dividing and conquering the quilting like this is that at any time you can change your mind and the quilting will be evenly dense across the entire quilt. And that yellow thread really blends in nicely to the quilt, even though the quilt itself has so much color. What I found is that if you use a lighter pastel colored thread, it will usually blend in nicely to the darker fabrics. Or think of it this way, a lighter colored thread is going to look better on a darker fabric compared to a darker thread on a lighter fabric. And as long as you use natural fiber materials like cotton thread, cotton fabric, and a natural batting like cotton or wool, you're not going to have any issues with your quilt being too stiff. I find that I have issues whenever I use polyester batting, so that's not my preference, but my favorite is cotton and wool or a combination of the two. I think this looks good, but I don't really like the whiskering that's starting to appear. Those are the wrinkles in between the lines of quilting. For my final pass across the quilt, my lines will be roughly 1/2 inch apart. Yep, that sure is a lot of quilting, but I didn't do it all at one time. I'm just eyeballing the distance between the lines as I quilt, and I'm not trying to match up any of those bumps. I'll just let it flow organically. And what I usually like to do is just quilt a little bit at a time. Maybe one day I'll do one pass across the quilt, and the next day I'll do a second pass across the quilt. Any way you like to break it up so it doesn't get too tedious. So right now I'm working my way from right to left across the quilt. So the bulk is tucked under the machine on my right hand side as I go. I only have to deal with scrunching half of the quilt under the machine at this point, and then I'll rotate it again once I get into the center of the quilt. Now I've rotated the quilt so everything that I've quilted so far is now off to my left, and I'm going to finish quilting the other half of the quilt, working my way from the center over to the right hand side of the quilt again. So now as I quilt, it will get less bulky on my right hand side as I go. Whenever you are unsure of yourself, just remember the best way to hide imperfect stitches is to surround them with more imperfect stitches. When you quilt densely like this, you're not going to notice the individual threads. Things are starting to flatten out and the texture looks really good here. Remember, this is a personal preference when choosing how much to quilt it, but the more you use it and the more you wash it, the softer and snugglier it will be. So here you can see all that yummy texture that occurs by quilting my lines so closely together. As I always say, when in doubt, add more quilting. I finished my quilt with a narrow binding in a color that matched my quilt backing, then I took it to the beach for some fun photos. Well, there you have it. That's how you make Puzzle Box, my free quilt pattern. Be sure to download it at ChristaQuilts.com/free pattern. And then head over to my online site at shop.ChristaQuilts.com to grab a couple of your favorite jelly rolls. No matter what, this quilt is gonna look great. You can even throw in fabrics from your stash to make it, and you can make it larger or smaller to suit your needs. Don't those wavy lines look so fun to quilt? They are one of the fastest designs you can do. So while you're at it, be sure you check out some of my other video tutorials showing how to not only baste your quilt, but also how to bind it either by hand or machine. So until next time, happy quilting!